It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to really thank the Queensland University of Technology and particularly the Institute of Environmental Futures for the invitation to come and talk as part of the Grand Challenge lecture series. I have to be honest, I didn't really know QUT prior to this trip, and Jim Reeves, who I think is here, was kind enough to give me a tour yesterday, and I mean the place is just absolutely extraordinary. It's not, well, I mean, you all know because you're here, but it's not only the buildings and the design and the sort of the care with which it's been designed, those wonderful Spanish steps, but it's actually the vibe of the place. So I've really been very generously welcomed, and the body language is also positive. People are smiling. I mean, it's a really, frankly, a wonderful advertisement for what a higher education can look like in the 21st century, it seems to me, and that the place has got such a buzz about it. So even if you're all miserably bored by what I have to say this afternoon, I've had a fantastic time. So, you know, thank you for that. Before I begin talking on the subject of today's lecture, though, I do want to begin by acknowledging that we farewelled a very significant Australian today. I spoke, of course, of the funeral of the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser. And I do think it's important to mark these things when they happen. I didn't know Mr. Fraser well, but he was generous with his time and advice when I sought it out from him. And I'll share with you the first time I met Mr. Fraser was at a nuclear disarmament event in Melbourne. It was an issue he felt very passionately about towards the end of his life, and I hadn't met him before. And so at the end of the sort of first tranche of proceedings, I kind of wandered up and introduced myself and said, "Oh, look, I wonder if it might be possible to make a time to come and see you to ask your advice on a range of matters." And obviously he's much taller than I am and sort of looked down at me with a slightly sort of arch expression and said in his characteristic patrician voice, and I won't impersonate it, but he said, "I doubt you would follow the advice that I would give." Well, try me. I don't know if you meant to say try me to an ex-Prime Minister, but I did, and he responded, "Well, I would invite the present occupants of the House of Federal Parliament out onto the Rainbow Warrior." And he paused. He said, "Then I would sail the Rainbow Warrior out to sea." He paused again. "And I would shove them off." And I laughed, and I said that alas, Greenpeace's ingrained ethic of non-violence meant that we couldn't force any elected representatives, or anyone else for that matter, to walk the plank. And he sort of twinkled at me and said, "Well, very well, you'd better come and have a conversation with me then." And so that was the start of a conversation where he was very generous with his advice. And I think much as we can celebrate the man's public service in the Parliament, regardless of one's politics, we should also celebrate the contribution he made post-politics as a voice of the conscience of this country in times when we have needed that voice on the question of refugees, on the question of national independence, on the question of good governance, on the question of climate change. And I think he is an elder of our country who will be very greatly missed. So the talk itself this afternoon draws on an essay that I've got in the most recent Griffith review, which is all about Western Australia, which is sort of on the other side of the continent for those who don't know it, called Looking West. But actually the themes that are in there, I think, are more broadly applicable and are intended to be more broadly applicable. And I start that essay with a story of something that happened in my family before I was born. And my parents were migrants from Europe, and they moved to a very unfashionable suburb on the outskirts of Perth. Was then unfashionable, maybe it's fashionable now, called Kelmscott, in the just on the edge of the foothills. And there was a ramshackle brick house with a few acres, and it ran down to a creek or a stream that they dignified by referring to as the River. And my father, who was a refugee from Nazism, fell in love with this river as soon as he saw it. And it was a remarkable watercourse. I mean, there's crustaceans of one sort or another in there, molluscs and fish, bird life, a beautiful, rich little local ecosystem. And my father's instant love of this place deepened when he sort of couldn't believe his eyes. It was the first time he went down there in broad daylight. And there are these large crustaceans, freshwater crayfish called marron, sort of, literally this long, just crawling across the rocks in broad daylight. And of course, marron are absolutely delicious. And so every so often, this chap who'd once been a sort of 14-year-old penniless refugee from the Nazis would fish out half a dozen of these animals, and my family would have this sort of imperial feast. But I was never part of that. And I was never part of that because of something that happened before I was born. Now, one day, my father went down to mosey around by the creek, and I mean, he would mosey around by there, and he'd come back sort of with his white string vest covered in mud, which sort of stunk, but in a kind of rich, aromatic way. It wasn't a horrible smell, or at least I don't remember it that way. And he apparently went down there and was confronted with the sight of a stranger, someone he'd never seen before, a man who'd pulled up on the opposite bank with a vehicle of some kind, and was going in and out of this little creek using a goggle and a snorkel where the pools were deep enough. And he had some kind of spear gun, I don't know if it was elasticated or what it was, and was taking out the marron by the sackful, was literally catching every marron he could find. And he continued and went one way and went back the other way. And after he'd gone, there weren't any marron left. That little creek was essentially fished out. We would occasionally see the odd marron in the years after that, in the years when I was born, but when we saw them, they were far too precious to eat. I never shared marron with my father, who's not with us anymore. He died a couple of years ago, because of this incident with this stranger who came to the opposing bank. Now, that happened before I was born, but I dreamt it. I dreamt it a lot as a child. You have these recurring dreams. You're never actually sure how often you have them because it's one of those dreams that it is recurring. It's sort of always there. And in the dreams, the stranger never has a face. The sacks are always full. And my father is weeping. I cannot console him in those dreams. And that's a dream that has persisted since my youth. And I suppose when I look at marron in Western Australia, I take some comfort from the fact that fishing out of that creek wasn't the end of that species. There are still marron around the place. They're still fished, in fact, heavily regulated and even farmed with some success in some places. But we know that the local extinctions, the local wiping out of creatures or reduction of creatures add up. And that's the national story, and that's the global story. Species of plants and animals are becoming extinct at an increasing rate. So the most recent Global Biodiversity Outlook, for example, which is published under the auspices of the UN Convention on Biodiversity, concluded that natural systems that support economies, lives and livelihoods across the planet are at risk of rapid degradation and collapse unless there is swift, radical and creative action to conserve and sustainably use the variety of life on Earth. So the global story is this one of reduction of the small local stories adding up. And this rate of ecological deterioration is now so pronounced that I guess, as many in this audience will know, will be familiar, that some scientists have begun referring to this period as one marking a Holocene or Anthropocene period of extinctions that can be compared to previous periods of dramatic species loss that we know from the fossil record. So we live in changing times, we live in challenging times. I'm sure also that many in the audience will be familiar with a paper that was published in Science in January this year that was written by Professor Will Stephan of the ANU and about 18 co-authors. My background is in the humanities, but I have come to understand that multi-authored scientific papers doesn't actually mean that scientists just work less hard. I have been disabused of that misapprehension. But in that paper, which really draws on the Stockholm Resilience Centre's collaborative work on planetary boundaries, and the paper is called Planetary Boundaries, Guiding Human Development on a Changing Planet. What the authors try and do is they update earlier research that is designed to identify the physical, biophysical, I should say, boundaries that are intrinsic to the operation of the Earth as a system. Beyond these boundaries, they argue, there may be non-linear changes in one or more of the subsystems that regulate the planet. Now, the really sort of troubling thing about this piece of work is that according to Will Stephan and the others, 4 of these 9 planetary boundaries have already been transgressed, and 2 of these, climate change and biosphere integrity, are what they call core boundaries. And what the paper argues is that altering either of the conditions beyond these core boundaries will drive Earth's system into a new state. That's rather antiseptic language, so let me try some metaphors for you. It's liable to plunge us into the Badlands, the uncharted seas, the frightening dark, the here be dragons. We just don't know what an Earth with biophysical conditions that are fundamentally different to that in which all human civilization has hitherto flourished. We just don't know what it might mean, what might happen. Now, change in biosphere integrity in particular is defined by Stephan and his team as meaning biodiversity loss and species extinction, and the authors do acknowledge that because of the nature of that system, that it's very difficult to establish with any kind of certainty where the planetary boundary might be. And the evidence, they say, instead points to the decline of biodiversity as constituting what they call a slow variable, so it lacks any clear planetary tipping point, but rather there are multiple geographically confined tipping points that together may add up to global concern. So, put another way, the local losses add up. And it makes me think back on the Marin story of my parents' creek, but it also makes me think on the sort of stuff that people kind of tell me in the job that I have, or I guess when someone finds out you work for Greenpeace, they tend to want to talk about the natural world, or in fact they tend to avoid the subject altogether, depending on how they feel about things. But I reckon, I guess, I put to you that actually probably we've all had experiences a bit like the Marin story, or we've heard of other people's stories that are a bit like that. You know the sort of moment when someone tells you about a great spot where they used to go that's kind of fished out now? Or when someone says something like, yeah, now I come to think of it, I haven't seen a lot of those around here in a while. Yeah, we used to see a lot of that bird or that animal. I haven't seen one in a bit. There used to be so many of them, but I haven't seen one in ages. Now you come to mention it. First time I came to Queensland in this job was 2012, and I was brought up to address your Queensland Media Club, which is a terrific institution. I think all of the states should have their own press clubs. And we'd just published a report called Cooking the Climate, Wrecking the Reef, which was talking about the extent to which the coal industry threatens the Great Barrier Reef, a subject that you may be unsurprised to learn I will talk a little bit more about later this afternoon. But I remember that I spent a few days in Brisbane, and it was the first time I'd been up here working for Greenpeace, and I was really keen just to chat. So, you know, from the sort of the first person I met in the first restaurant to the taxi driver that I had going somewhere to people who I was having meetings with, I just wanted to know what people were thinking. And what struck me was the number of people who did more or less the same thing, which is they sort of leant forward slightly. So there's that certain almost air of the confessional. They sort of leant forward slightly and the voice would drop. I'd say something like, "Mate, reef's not what it was." Or they'd say, "It's not like it used to be when I was a kid." Or they'd say, "You know, I took my little ones down to have a look at the reef and just thinking how much it had changed." And I kept hearing this, and it got to the point almost where I'd sort of go, "Oh yeah, this is the bit of the conversation where the person leans forward and tells me that they're worried about the Great Barrier Reef." I was shocked by it. I was genuinely shocked by it. And I really want to stress that these were not just environmentalists I was talking to. These were just people I was meeting who had, in their own lifetimes, noticed or perceived a transformation. And I guess what we know is that the scientific data is consistent with what I was hearing as anecdotes. We know, thanks to the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences 2012 study, that around 50% of the coral cover from the reef has gone since 1985. We know, based on the Australian government's own strategic assessment for the reef, that 24 out of the 41 metrics or attributes that collectively comprise the outstanding universal value of the Great Barrier Reef. Side note, that's a collection of language that takes all the poetry out of the place, but anyway, 24 out of 41 have deteriorated since 1981. The anecdotal evidence of fewer fish, fewer birds, less colour, less coral of the reef was not what it was, mate. The anecdotal evidence is validated by the data. Now that, of course, is extremely serious, worrying news. But I guess we can reflect that it is good news that the evidence is being compiled, that we know what's going on. And on that subject, I want to pause for a moment just to acknowledge the work that is done, the creative, the diligent, the backbreaking sometimes work that is done by researchers, scientists, mathematicians, but across a whole range of fields in keeping track of the natural world for us. It is so crucial, and I want to honour that work and acknowledge it. And also acknowledge the solutions that come out of it. I had lunch with Matthew, Dr. Matthew Dunn-Babin, and I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce Matt's surname, so I hope I've got it right. If he's here, then he can tell me, and if he's not, then obviously the lunch was quite annoying for it. Well, I mean, so yesterday, I mean, in terms of cool things people do in the world, I mean, someone who can say, oh, we'll catch up for a sandwich, and I will show you a robot that I am building that can swim through the ocean and recognise crown of thorn starfish and poison them to deal with this threat to the reef. Now, this is wonderful stuff, and I you know, thanks for a great lunch, apart from anything else, but you've got to honour this work of people who are not only diagnosing the problem, but coming up with the solutions. And, you know, good on QUT for having that community of scholars who is doing that work. I am so grateful to the researchers who are giving us that picture of what is happening to the world. And your work should also be honoured by our politicians. Your work provides us with the necessary evidentiary foundation on which our political leaders can make the changes we need and can spend the money that we need spent to solve the problem. That's the great thing about the research that you are collectively doing as a community of scholars. It should be a great story of scientific data, data coming from non-scientific disciplines as well. Yes, the social sciences and the humanities do produce data worth listening to as well. I'm willing to say that. My background is the humanities, as I fessed up. And it should be a good story of that data being listened to and then there being a proportionate and effective political and policy response. That should be our story. But unfortunately, we have a problem in our democracy. Unfortunately, the crown of thorns is not the only pestilence that has fallen upon a great and vibrant system. All too often our political leaders ignore the evidence. The evidence that should be providing a compelling foundation for reform is ignored. I want to put to you that the health of our political system, like the health of the Great Barrier Reef, is in trouble. And we know with our political system as well, by both a matter of study and as a matter of bitter anecdote, we know that the provision of data is proving to be insufficient in getting the political change that we need across a range of issues where there are very significant risks and opportunities that confront our community, our society, our economy. It's not all bad. There have been times when the system of governance has responded, and let's celebrate the Montreal Protocol, which did deliver us a global response to ozone depletion. But largely the experience has been in the other direction. And if we think about those two core boundaries I mentioned earlier, in particular, climate change and biosphere integrity, we have seen egregious failures on behalf of governments in Australia and worldwide. Lavishly documented egregious failures. It's slightly unnerving having a room full of people watching you drink water. Will this be the time I miss my mouth and pour it down my shirt? Not on that occasion. I remember 12 months or so ago reading a feature in the Courier Mail. It was about the Great Barrier Reef, and the journalist was covering the brouhaha, the contest over the future of the reef. And the journalist in question concluded with an anecdote that I'd like to read to you. And the anecdote was this. A little girl, watched by her father, fits her mask and snorkel for her first glimpse of what lies beneath her finned feet. She begins to swim, her mask flat on the surface, but almost immediately stops. "Dad, Dad," she yells, her own face full of natural wonder. "You've got to see this. You won't believe what's under there. It's really, really..." She searches momentarily for the right word. "Great." And the journalist concludes, "The one thing everyone shares in this particular story is the hope that it always will be." Now that is a very reassuring narrative that we all want the same thing, that we do all want the Great Barrier Reef to not only stay as great as it is now, but to recover its former glory. It's a reassuring thought, and it's a reassuring thought that I think is profoundly wrong. I want to put to you that I don't believe that we all want the same thing. Or to elaborate further, I think that the roles that we play within institutional structures mean that whatever we may personally think, even if it is true that we all want the same thing, we are precluded from acting that way. And I want to put to you further that I think that it is the structure and political economy of our national society that means that we end up with outcomes in which nature, in which landscapes, in which our common good, in which the prospects of our children are sacrificed for short-term gain. And to make that point, I want to go back to that little creek in Western Australia and the event with the fellow with the sax in the 1960s. Now, I'm told, or I was told, that my father did actually remonstrate with him. I mean, my dad was never backward in coming forward and letting people know what he thought. And in good West Australian fashion, the stranger told my father, I believe his words were, "Piss off." And, the stranger said, "Piss off," to my father, because he was perfectly within his rights to be doing what he was doing. And I think this is a really fundamental point. The stranger had every legal right to do as he pleased in taking the marron out of that little creek. He had the legal right to do it, and he had the technological capacity. That was what gave the faceless man the ability to denude the creek of its animals. If we think about that, let's extrapolate out from that and think that maybe some version of that does sort of go on in the wider world. And I guess that's what I'm suggesting to you, is an argument by extrapolation, and it's what I suggest in that Griffith essay. But I think if we do extrapolate out, isn't it curious how we don't tend to use the language of agency, of power, when we contemplate the killing and destruction of plants and animals and ecosystems? Our language kind of becomes weirdly passive. We don't talk about power distribution or political structures. We tend to sort of start referring to these things in a sort of weird way as kind of unfortunate byproducts, accidental consequences of economic activities, which are, of course, the main game. And let's just, to illustrate the point I'm trying to make, let's take that seminal expression, biodiversity loss. Now, it's a key concept in the literature, and Will Stephan and his team use it when they explain what biosphere integrity means. They call it biodiversity loss and species extinction. Loss? Loss? I mean, it's just such a curious phrase, biodiversity loss. I mean, it suggests an accidental or consequential forfeiture. You don't intend to lose something. Do you remember the last time you deliberately lost your car keys? I mean, you don't do that. Synonyms for loss: mislaying, misplacement, dropping, forgetting, overlooking. How can I have misplaced the dodo? What did I do with that Christmas Island pipistrelle? Goodness me, I thought I'd lost the Lord Howe Island stick insect, but it was behind that rock all along. I mean, we simply don't speak this way. Loss, perhaps above all, though, implies a kind of neutrality. There's no intention there. We don't mean to lose things. Again, think of your car keys. And I think I dwell on this because I think the term is so important, because I think language matters and is constitutive and is expressive of power relations. And I think the expression biodiversity loss hides the truth. Let's be honest. We don't lose biodiversity, we kill it. On most occasions, when given the choice, we, as an economy, as a polity, deprioritise the survival of life on Earth in nature. The diversity of life on Earth in nature, and one way or another, we kill it. And we may not leap out of our cars and strangle animals, it may not be anything like that, but one way or another, this is what happens. This is what the conversion of ecosystems, this is what the exercise of our power is doing. To be more precise, our legal and political structures and associated political economy guide our active choices towards the decision to kill off our biodiversity. Or, to use the language of economists, we expend the variety of life on Earth as an unaccounted externality. That, I think, is the truth of what biodiversity loss means. Those who construct new coal mines, those who cut down the forests, those who pump their pollution into the sky, they are killing off biodiversity and changing the climate in the process, and they are doing so because they have the right and the power to do so. The authors of the CSIRO's most recent report on biodiversity in Australia, there are some very nice lines, very understated lines in the report. there's one line towards the end which says, every decision on natural resource management is a choice. Every decision on natural resource management is a choice. Now, on this point, I do want to go back to our friends in the community who are leaning forward and troubling about the state of the Great Barrier Reef. And let's think about what choices are being made there. 4 days ago, the Australian and Queensland governments publicly released the Reef 2050 Long-Term Sustainability Plan. And according to Prime Minister Tony Abbott, through the plan, Australia is telling the international agencies that we are utterly committed as an entire nation to the protection of the Great Barrier Reef. I wonder if it was a Freudian slip that he used the expression telling the international agencies. In other words, this was a telling rather than a doing. Whether it was a slip or not, I think what Mr Abbott is telling the world is rather different to the truth, because bluntly, the plan as it has been elaborated can't save the reef in and of itself. It's not that the plan's entirely bad, it's just inadequate. And it's inadequate because it still allows for massive coal port expansion. It doesn't address the question of climate change, it just sort of says, well, that's something that'll happen somewhere else. And it doesn't address the cumulative impacts of development. Let's think about climate change in particular. It's well documented that it's the single greatest long-term threat to the Great Barrier Reef. It's equally as well documented that coal is the single greatest source of carbon emissions worldwide. And we also know very, very well that Queensland's coal reserves are among the largest in the world, one of the largest carbon bombs still in the ground, to use a phrase. 2050 Reef Plan is effectively silent on all of this. We know that the current flashpoint is the Indian transnational company Adani that proposes to build the world's largest coal port on the Great Barrier Reef coast at Abbott's Point in order to export coal from its proposed new mega mine at Carmichael in Queensland's Galilee Basin. We also know that if Adani is successful, that may well be a gateway mine that will lead to further mining of the Galilee and further port infrastructure. Dealing with this threat is not mentioned by the Reef 2050 plan, and the experts have been quick, and again, let us honour the contribution of researchers and of experts, have been quick to point this out. So Professor Terry Hughes of JCU, an eminent coral reef expert, for example, has said this: the government wants to have coal mines operating in 60 years' time and still hopes to have a healthy reef. The science says otherwise. Either we plan to adequately protect the reef and transition away from fossil fuels, or we abandon the reef and develop the world's largest thermal coal mines. We can't possibly do both. We can't possibly do both. Now, some years ago, another expert, a lawyer this time, rather than a scientist, Chris Mcgrath from the University of Queensland, wrote in a piece for Crikey that no one likes to say it out loud, but we should publicly recognise that we are planning to destroy the Great Barrier Reef. Chris Mcgrath's words. Every decision on natural resource management is a choice. By its silence and its omissions on the coal industry and the cumulative development impacts and on climate change, the Reef 2050 plan is simply inadequate. And that would be troubling enough in and of itself, but we need to see that plan, I think, as both a product and an example of the broader problem. And the broader problem is that our legal and political structures and associated political economy have guided the active choices of the state and federal governments that have led to this sadly inadequate plan. Sadly inadequate clam. Maybe a sad clam at the plan, but that was a misspeak. We just don't have the political structures and the political economy that we need to preserve the integrity of life on Earth, to safeguard our future prosperity. Now, there are a number of crucial dynamics around this, and I'm sure it's a conversation we should have at length, but there are just two that I want to mention. And the first is that there is absolutely no doubt that vested interests have too much influence over our political leaders and our political processes. And here I just want to, for a moment, dwell upon the politics of climate change, because it's often represented as being fantastically complicated. But a fellow by the name of Tom Burke, who's a London environmentalist, but he's done a range of things. He's worked for Rio Tinto as well. He's done other things. You know, Tom's a bit of a raconteur. And he sort of sat me down one day at, you know, one of those sort of cafes or pubs or a greasy spoon or somewhere in London and sort of, we all make it too complicated. I can't do the voice, but there's a bit of gravel there. And what Tom says is this: it's all very simple. On the one hand, there are the climate makers. And the climate makers are the fossil fuel companies, first and foremost, and the small number of others who are, the small number of large businesses who produce and burn fossil fuels. And that's the climate makers. And on the other side, there's everyone else. In Australia, the arch climate makers are the coal mining companies, and bluntly, they've just got too much influence on our political system. So that's the first dynamic. The second dynamic I want to mention is the problem of the structure of business corporations, because business corporations are legally mandated to profit maximise for shareholders at the expense of other considerations. This means they are pre-programmed to not worry about the unfortunate consequences of their business activities. And we hear all sorts of bizarre things said about corporations, but they are amoral entities. Expecting a corporation to have a conscience is a bit like expecting a chair to fall in love with you. They are amoral entities that exist pursuant to statutes, and the statutes direct them to maximise profit for shareholders. Now, I want to be really clear about this. This is not anti-business, it's not anti-capitalist. If you look at Milton Friedman, he will say much the same thing about the nature of the business corporation. But if you want business to do something, you actually have to regulate, or it has to be in the business interest to do so. There are the only ways that business will actually, in inverted commas, do the right thing. So a few years ago, when one of those global consultancies did a multi-country survey of top business executives about what would get them to do something about biodiversity loss caused by their business, the top choice on what would spur them to action was increased regulation. The business themselves admitting this. Of course, in reality, in practice, business tirelessly campaigns against any regulation of environmental activity, which they have delightfully named green tape. Just remember that every time you see a national park or a colourful parrot or a fish, remember that there are some lobbyists out there who see that and just think of green tape. What this means is that even the most committed and well-meaning individuals within corporate structures, and there are many, many of them, this is not about that, are constricted by the ambit of their institution, by the ambit of their business, because of what is mandated in the legislation that governs corporations. So extrapolating out from that opening story of the creek in my parents' backyard, I put to you that it is the vested interests that are the faceless men of global biodiversity loss and climate change, and that their plunder is every bit as rapacious as that in that little creek in Kelmscott. So I'm about to enter the last bit of this talk. So I want to, before I finish, I just want to, and it's a sort of, it's not quite the last few moments, but we're entering the home stretch. And I just want to pause to restate my central argument at this point. The central argument is that we have a problem in our democracy, and the problem is that too often our political leaders are ignoring the evidence which should provide a compelling foundation for reform, and that they're ignoring it not because they're thick or because they're blind, but because they are captive to a set of political and economic power relations which conduce to prevent action. And of course, it's not only that they're ignoring the problems,
but they're also ignoring the solutions. I mean, one of the frustrating things is that you see the genius that's on display. Not just Matt that I'm talking about, but he's clearly one of them. The genius that is on display in coming up with ways of sorting out some of these pickles. So I heard a presentation from Anna Scarbeck from Climate Works in Melbourne the other day. She's a very good communicator and a stunning presentation because their modelling tells us, very sophisticated modelling, it's part of a global project that tells us we can decarbonise by 2050. If we trust in our genius and we trust in our technology and we look to the solutions that are there or that we can see are just slightly over the horizon, we'll make it. We've got this, we know the problems, we've got the solutions. The blockages are the vested interests, the blockages are the power relations. That is what is holding us back. That, my friends, is a grand challenge for us and for our times. So, having set up what I think the problem is, what's the solution? See if I spill it down the front of my shirt this time. And I am a clumsy person. I was sharing with some new friends today that the only physical scar I've occasioned so far in my 8 years or so working for Greenpeace is when I fell off my chair next to my desk trying to put a piece of paper in the bin, and I have a 4-inch scar down my right leg as a consequence of scratching myself on the chair on the way down. So drinking water is it's a challenge, right? What is the solution to this grand challenge of the vested interests, of the power relations that are holding back the genius of this country and the thirst that is there to manifest the solutions that we need for the common good? What is the solution? Well, I'm actually enormously optimistic that we are already in the midst of the shift that we need to see to achieve these solutions. Now again, Anna Scarbeck of Climate Works likes to point out that from the depth of despair in the Great Depression to Neil Armstrong stepping out on the moon was 35 years, which would be the same period of time between now and the decarbonisation of the Australian economy in 2050, by 2050. But let's be slightly more ambitious than that. I am a great lover of and believer in the welfare state. And I say that because my parents were Depression-era children. And so I grew up not being able to ever put food in the bin. I still find it difficult if you go out to dinner with me and we share a Chinese or something around one of those moving tables. I feel anxious if there's a snow pea left on a plate at the end and I will have to kind of eat it because I feel this inherited anxiety from my parents with the possibility that some food might go in the bin. Let's remember that from the depths of the Great Depression to the establishment of the welfare state in the United Kingdom was less than 20 years. We often imagine with terror the speed with which bad things can happen. But let's think instead with optimism of the occasions in history when we have managed massive transformations for the common good. We have done it before and we can do it again. And I believe we are seeing a new politics emerging, rapidly emerging in this country, which marks a decisive shift of power within Australian society. I believe we are seeing the shift away from the vested interests of the fossil fuel companies having the run of the place to more evidence-based policy and to a greater preoccupation with our shared good, our common good. I believe the new politics is emerging that will see us achieve that rapid decarbonisation. And I think we see that new politics in the grand alliance of Australian people that is coming together to challenge the fossil fuel companies and other vested interests. I think we see that new politics emerging out of economic relations. We see it emerging out of the decentralisation of the energy system that is happening despite the best intentions of the dirty power companies to prevent it. I think we see it in the emergence of the new political forms and the new ways of tackling this problem. I think we see it in the smiling, confident faces of groups like Fossil-Free QUT. Do give us a wave, you're here somewhere. And Fossil-Free UQ. I mean, this is the politics. This is the new politics that will deliver this country into a very different place. We see it in the Australian religious response to climate change. We see it in the global divestment movement, manifested with such energy in Australia. We see it in the social movement that is Lock the Gate. And if you haven't seen Frack Man yet, please go out and see Frack Man. What a film. I think we see it in the refreshment, if you like, of organisations like Greenpeace. I think we see it in a groundswell of the Australian people. So how do we make sure of it? How do we make sure this new politics takes hold and flourishes? Well, I'm going to make 3 suggestions and then I'll wrap up and let's have a chat. And the first, and this is absolutely essential, scientists and researchers must keep up the noble work of speaking up, of telling us what you are finding, and of explaining carefully in your measured words when political pronouncements are failing to properly take account of the evidence that you are assembling and interpreting, because only if this truth-telling continues will the case for change remain there. As Dan Kahan has pointed out, and people in science communications will of course know his work very well, the quality of the science communication environment is so important to the health of our democracy. And I think a crucial part of this new politics has to involve the enhancement of our science communication environment, more funding for CSIRO, more independence for scientific institutions, more basic science education, more celebration of what science communications means. Second, I think we have to recognise we need, I've spoken about the emergence of the new politics, but we need more and more and more. An increased public mobilisation is vital because it is only the power of organised people that can effectively take on the vested interests. And a quick advertisement here, please, if you haven't already, do jump on the website of Greenpeace or Get Up or whoever it might be. Choose your preferred organisation to support and get involved. Get involved. I know there are some sheets you can sign up for. Hands up again, fossil free, hands up. You can go and sign up afterwards. Please get involved in the conversation because, let me be plain about this, I want to work with all of you on this. I want us to be partners in shifting the future of the country towards the common good. And we know that power never concedes anything without a struggle. We have to look to the past. We know that the suffragettes did not get votes for women without a struggle. We know that the anti-slavery movement only succeeded with a struggle. We know, whether it's trying to stop wars or it's decolonisation or whatever it might be, land rights, that redressing injustice only comes from struggle. And we must remember what we have achieved in the past in this country. It is only because of the power and determination of the Australian people that the Great Barrier Reef was not wrecked by oil drilling in the 1980s. It is only because of the power and determination of the Australian people that the Daintree rainforest stands. It is only because of the power and determination of the Australian people that the Franklin Dam was not built. And the power and determination of the Australian people are needed once again. And that, I guess, takes me to the third of what I see as the key things here, which is that our objectives must be about shifting power rather than simply participating in existing processes. we won't succeed if our efforts are concentrated in getting that submission in on time or being part of this consultation or going to that round table. It's not that these things are bad, but they are insufficient. We have to change the rules of the game because the rules of the game are stacked to the benefit of vested interests. And this stuff is not as hard as it might necessarily appear. They banned donations by property developers in New South Wales for the good of the New South Wales polity, and goodness me, that has made a difference. Well, why not ban donations from coal companies or mining companies in Queensland? Is there a single person around who can credibly say that it would not be a good thing for Queensland's democracy if mining companies were not allowed to give money to politicians? So, the argument that I've put to you this afternoon is that the phenomenon of ecological decline is upon us, and that it's a phenomenon that is best understood as a product of the functioning of power. We know the problems, we know the solutions, but what's getting in our way is a set of power relations that prevents progress. And I think something else is possible. A different kind of politics, a politics in which good science and vibrant democracy are mutually supportive. The last time I went to that creek in Kelmscott, because it's still there, my parents' house isn't anymore. It was demolished for a highway years ago. It's another story. But the creek's still there, and I went and found a bit of it that runs through a park, and I bent down close to it. I put my hand in, I pulled out some of the mud. I smelt the mud, and it's one of those Proustian moments, transported back to being a child. I looked around and I couldn't see any animals in the water, but I could see, I suppose it is an animal, but I could see a mollusc. You know, there are some river clams that live there, molluscs, mussels. I'm actually not sure what they are. They'd always been there. And I sort of, not sure whether I should or not, but I pulled one out and I held it in my hand and I put it back. And I think to myself, maybe that's all there is living in that creek now. Maybe that's all there is now. But the creek is still there. And what is in that creek in the future is open. And what's in all the creeks of the world in the future is open to us. And what sort of reef is there in the future is open to us. And what swims in the ocean and what kind of trees grow and what lives in them is open to us. And I guess I back us to get it right. I think the new politics is upon us, and I think we will prevail. Thank you.